So, good evening. And as you know, we're going to talk about Joseph Haydn, who was born in Rohrau, which is even today only a town of 1600. And he was born in 1732. And his dad was a wheelwright and also the equivalent of the mayor of this tiny little place. And they were a musical family, but definitely not. His parents were not trained musicians, but they noticed right away that little Joseph was very musical, and so they sent him to the nearby town of Hainburg to get some training. He studied with his relative, who was Johann Frank, who didn't treat him great, didn't see that he was fed all the time. And this started when Joseph was 6 already. And so from the age 6, he never lived with his parents anymore. The music director of St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna came through Hainburg on one of his regular trips looking for choir boys, and he auditioned Haydn and ended up hiring him. And so he was a professional musician at age 7 already. Although again, he wasn't terribly well treated, didn't always get all the food that he should have got, and so had to run around doing gigs to to try and get enough food, actually. If you've been to Vienna, you'll recognize St. Stephen's Cathedral. Um, the and this building over here is no longer exists, but at the time that's where the Kapellmeister lived, and so that's where Haydn lived for about 10 years. And so when by the time he was 17, his voice had broken. The Empress started complaining about his singing voice. He cut somebody's pigtail off in church one day, who was standing in front of him, and so he got unceremoniously kicked out of the choir. I should mention parenthetically that he was briefly considered to be a castrato. You may be familiar. This is somebody who is castrated to become a permanent soprano, but for some reason, thankfully for him, I guess he was not. That operation ended up not happening. So this was his first real teacher, or not. I shouldn't say his first real teacher that whose name we really know, or as or whose name is known, let's put it this way, whose occasionally played Nicola Porpora. And so Haydn had no compositional studies before meeting Porpora, but he had a lot of admiration for him. And he also, at the time, as a late teenager, studied a lot of CPE Bach sonatas and the standard texts. There's already composition textbooks by Johann Fuchs and Matheson. And so for the next 3 or 4 years, he just struggled around as a freelance musician, singing and doing whatever he could to exist in Vienna. And but by age 21, he had written his first opera, which was called The Limping Devil. So unfortunately, this opera is lost. The text survives. It had 2 successful shows, but that's a big deal already at age 21 to have written an opera that got performed. Um, it's 1757. He got his first job, which wasn't extremely well paid, but was certainly wonderful to have a job. This is a bit of a rundown castle today, which is Dolny Lukce in the Czech Republic, or excuse me, Lukavice, and he was the employee of Count Morzen, and so like many noble people, he spent the winter in Vienna and the summer at this place, and Haydn wrote somewhere between 11 and 15 symphonies here. This I should say that the symphonies in the early part of Haydn's output are not. The numbering is very confusing. It's just a musicological thing. For example, I'm going to later play you some of Haydn's Symphony Number 6, and that was, but it was written. It could be his 15th symphony. There's a lot of confusion about that kind of thing. And I should mention that he has 104 numbered symphonies, but actually there were 106. So there's also symphonies number A and B. It's a matter of musicology. People are going back and rediscovering things. But the total stands as far as at 106 as far as we know. So um, by 17 Yeah, hold on here. Yeah, it was 1760 that he encountered his famous patron, the Esther, one of the first of four Esterhazy princes that he worked for. The Esterhazy family was probably the richest and most important noble family in Hungary, and it involved doubling pay and moving over to there was first of all Esterhazy Palace in Eisenstadt, which was at the time in Hungary and is now in Austria. And later on, they built a second palace further out in the country, farther away from Vienna, called Esterhazy. And so he spent actually the next 30 years out at Esterhazy, which was quite remote. Started to write a ton of music, and he had a and artistically, it was an excellent time because he had access to an orchestra literally every day. But the work was a huge amount of work, huge amount of music he wrote, and like not a lot else to do out there. Frankly, it was really quite remote. So I'm going to just, as an example of some of these early symphonies, one of the first ones he wrote while working for the Esterhazys. I'm going to play this. The symphony Le Matin, the morning, and it's called that because the introduction of it sounds a bit like a sunrise. The title does not come from Haydn, and the numbers 7 and 8 were quickly nicknamed Le Midi and Le Soir, right? So, but they have nothing to do with this kind of the titles have nothing to do with the music. They're just sort of tacked on there as sort of fanciful additions. But you can be the judge here of whether the opening sounds like a sunrise. When you get to the Allegro, there's a lot of wonderful virtuoso woodwind playing. And you see the cellist that you're looking at here, Stephen Isserlis, is actually leading the symphony from the cello, which is unusual but interesting. And so here's the opening of the Symphony Number 6. A lot of things to talk about today, so we'll move on. But you hear the like literally almost every Haydn symphony starts with a slow introduction of varying lengths and then moves on to an allegro like that. So I've got some more things to show you here. Let me see. Let me just take a second so I can see, so we can all see, or that I can see underneath my. There we go. Okay. There's Esterhazy Palace in Eisenstadt, and you can see, unlike the Count Morzen's castle, it's in totally excellent shape, more or less. Well, the family kept it in shape a long time, but then since then, the association with Haydn has kept a lot of tourists coming there, and this is now what's now known as the Haydnsaal, and it was not known as it was not really used primarily as a concert hall back in the day, but sure is a fabulous place, and they have a lot of events there and a lot of concerts nowadays. Done the first and here is the is Esterhazy, which is, or excuse me, I guess I should say, if I'm going to get my correct Hungarian out, it's Esterhazy. Okay, so please, anybody correct me if I'm wrong, but here I'm going to try it again. Esterhazy. Okay, that's the best I can do for my Hungarian. And Here's the interior of Esterházy, and so these guys, yeah, like I said, one of the wealthiest Hungarian families. So for the first 68 years, excuse me, 58 years of Haydn's life, he lived just in this little triangle of places. And um, here's where he was born in Rorau, then briefly in Hainburg, spent many years at different times in Vienna, and Eisenstadt is where the first palace was I showed you, the first Esterhazy Palace, and the border of back in those days went more like this. So Eisenstadt was also in Hungary, had a Hungarian name, and then what is still in modern day Hungary is Esterházy. So from here to there, it's just 100 kilometers. So that was it. That was his whole world for the first 58 years of his life. In his early days, actually back when working for Count Mortzin, he married. This is Anna, and we're talking. Oh yeah, Maria Anna Keller. Okay, and yeah, this is a kind of a sad story. They didn't get along really at all, and in fact, the story goes that her at one time, she actually baked fish in one of his manuscripts, which is kind of a tragedy for musicology, that's for sure. But just didn't get along at all. And in fact, it's alleged and pretty much accepted that you see this name Ludwig Guttenbrunn, who painted this portrait. She had a long-standing affair with him, and Haydn had some other stuff going on the side. He was a very devout Catholic, and every piece he ever wrote had "In the name of the Lord" in Latin at the top of it, and at the bottom of it, it had "Praise God." He was a very devout Catholic, but not entirely without sin. Let's say that. And also, it should be remarked that Beethoven's one of his most famous quotes is he wrote to Prince Lichnowsky, who had given him and would continue to give him quite a lot of money to pay his bills, but he did have the nerve to say that there are many princes, but there's only one Beethoven. And so that was the beginning of an idea of the artist as a very special person. But in the 18th century, they didn't have that idea. I mean, I think, the Esterházys knew they were dealing with somebody special, but they didn't. They still had to dress like a butler, and he still had to, eat at the servants' table and this kind of thing. It was literally 30 years before he started to get any kind of permission to travel or permission to sell his music to publishers, stuff like this. So socially, it was quite a different world. This is his main patron, which was Paul Esterhazy, or excuse me, Nicholas Esterhazy, and the like I said, there were four different princes over the years that Haydn worked for, but this was the one he worked for sure the longest. And it's not. I mean, he got a great deal of respect from the Esterhazy family, but he also had to work for them, and follow their artistic whims for sure. For example, Prince Nicholas played the baritone. What the heck is that? Well, here it is. Here's one of them. It's like a viol, and you see it's got seven strings on this side and a whole bunch of strings on that side, and the most of the ones over on this side over here are plucked, so they're used as bass reinforcement. So, but otherwise, it's played like a viola da gamba. And so, if you can believe it, Haydn wrote 162 trios for baritone, right? So I mean, they can be played probably by, by two cellos and a viola today. I don't think I've ever heard one on the original instrument, but you're going to hear one right now. So the instrument on the left is a baritone. So what you heard there in the second phrase was the player was playing the plucked strings. So there's a lot of possibilities. You could, as you heard, you had a whole enough strings to play easily a full octave of scales. So later, the prince decided that he got bored with baryton, and he decided to get interested in opera. So he built an opera house, got the costumes and the director and the whole shebang together. You can so this guy had money to burn, that's for sure. And in the end, Haydn ended up writing 15 operas there at that, and one earlier and one later. But the main output of operas was the 15 that he wrote at Esterhazy there. And uh, we just don't play any of those. And this is, I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but I'm going to introduce a little thesis here, which is to say that that Haydn was primarily a motivic composer, and as opposed to Mozart, who was primarily melodic. And so, what do I mean by that? It's like you'll see when I take this Symphony No. 104 apart that his thinking was primarily motivic, and this is something definitely he passed to Beethoven. So as you know, motives are just little tiny chunks of music as opposed to great big long melodies that Mozart liked to write. Some other examples of melodic composers would be Tchaikovsky and Chopin. And another example of a motivic composer would be Wagner, for example. So there might be a bias to saying that motivic composers have their music is a little bit, I don't know if what's the word to say. It's easier. It's technically more impressive, I guess. In terms of compositional technique. But of course, where would we be without the melodic composers either? But basically, Beethoven took after Haydn in terms of symphonies and string quartets, which are all motivically organized. However, in Beethoven's output, he looked at Mozart's music more for concertos. In fact, his concertos are modeled specifically after particular Mozart concertos in particular keys, and his one opera is also modeled more after Mozart's operas. So let me go back to share screen here. So he wrote, now a string quartet, formally speaking, is no different than a symphony. It's got 4 movements, and which, the first movement, slow movement, and a minuet, and then the last movement, and the form of it is in sonata form. The modern, or the standard version of which is more or less created by Haydn out of pre-existing examples. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. But he more or less invented the string quartet as we know it, with its standard instrumentation of 2 violins, a viola, and a cello. And I'm just going to play you an example of one of his more fun quartets which he wrote when he was working at Esterhazy there. And then we go back to the top. Yeah, what a wonderful piece. That's the last movement of the Lark Quartet. And as you heard in the B section there was a little fugue, and everybody got to play 16th notes, clearly the main burden of this piece falls on the first violin. So about Haydn's social life out at Esterhazy, he did find it lonely out there, just a lot of hard work, way the heck out in the countryside, and he was able to get to Vienna from time to time. He played quartets with Mozart in those days, and there was some other. I don't know if it was Pleyel or who. It temporarily escapes me, but they would get Mozart and Haydn and Pleyel and some other extremely well-noted musician got together to play quartets. Wouldn't it be great to be in that room? And during these visits, this was also later when he started to be the teacher of Beethoven. Back in at Esterhazy, he was his social life, as I mentioned. If he and his wife couldn't stand each other, so he did take a lover who was Luigia Poltelli, and it's said that he had an illegitimate son with her, which he never acknowledged in writing, but other people wrote about it. And the son eventually just stayed on working at playing the violin at Esterhazy into the 19th century. And it was his. So the prince was a big opera fan and quite in the know about who was great and who wasn't so great, and had definite opinions about who should continue on. And the story goes that he was not so happy with her singing, and that is Luigia, and wanted to fire her. And her husband wasn't such a great violinist either. They were both there. Everybody who came there was just there to play. There wasn't anything else around. But the word got out that Haydn definitely wanted her to stick around, and so the prince was nice enough to not fire her. So that's how that worked. They hung around there for some years. Um, so again, you go back to the kind of the this whole system basically depending on the whim of the aristocrats who run the thing. In 1790, Prince Nicholas died, and his son basically decided he either didn't have or didn't want to spend all that money on having an opera house and an orchestra running all the time, and that came to a crashing halt. Although Haydn continued to get a reasonable salary and a generous pension a pension from the dead prince and a reasonable salary, and with very few duties whatsoever. So at this time, Haydn took off to London, where he was already famous, having never visited, and his music preceded him basically all over Europe by the time it started to get published. So Haydn wrote his last 12 symphonies for the London stage. The impresario Solomon hired him to come there, and he was a big splash. In fact, there's a story one time another impresario hired his student Pleyel to come, basically trying to get a rivalry going to excite some public, some interesting writing in the press and this kind of stuff. But Pleyel and Haydn had absolutely no interest in creating any rivalry, and had lunch together a lot, and then basically and played each other's music on the competing concerts and stuff like this. So like I say, he was also awarded an honorary doctorate from Oxford University in 1792, and there's now a symphony nicknamed Oxford Symphony, although it had been written previously. So 5 years later, there was yet another new one prince dies, another one takes over, and he wanted him to come back and work. The new one wanted him to come back and work part-time. So Haydn was totally content with that. The salary went back up, and he spent most of his time in Vienna, but went out to Eisenstadt to mostly to take care of the church music. And so there's an interesting story behind that as well. I'm going to start sharing screen here. So those of you who are in my church choir at St. Andrews will know this piece, and probably not only that. This piece is possibly in Catholic and Anglican churches the most performed mass is the Haydn's Little Organ Mass. It's called that because in the Benedictus there's a great big organ solo with soprano solo. And interestingly enough, just to take a little sidebar here, Mozart's boss when he was a young man, Prince Archbishop Colloredo in Salzburg, was not terribly sympathetic towards Mozart, and also a big church reformer. So wanted to get the mass down to 1 hour, which involved leaving out a lot of Mozart's music, which is, in with the 2020 hindsight, turns out to be. I think we all know Mozart's name today, and not no nobody in Colorado's name is known only in association with Mozart. But that was one part. Getting the mass shorter was only part of the one part of the reforms. The other part, which was instituted by the Holy Roman Empire Emperor Joseph II. That's the famous one who said that there were too many notes in the abduction from the Seraglio. He not only had these church reforms, but also a very wide tolerance for all kinds of different religions, and made this a law. And so unfortunately, he didn't reign that long, and so those laws got changed, not very many years after, to the detriment of religious diversity, but to the benefit of church music, because Haydn was able to go back to writing whatever he wanted. But so if you can imagine that, Haydn had to get a mass done in 50 minutes, or excuse me, 15 minutes. That was the target, and this is probably the shortest setting of this Catholic mass that there is. In fact, you see here I'm pointing to this Gloria in this recording, which is a pretty slow recording, takes 1 minute to perform. And just for reference, like in Bach's Mass in B minor, the same text takes 40 minutes. So now how does he achieve this? He's going to, so here, just to look at the beginning of it. So there's the first line, and just look at all the text we've got here, right? There's 4 lines of text going on, right? It's not much for intelligibility. Definitely, you're not, you're not the you're not communicating the text in much of a meaningful way, but he's just trying to provide a short entertainment that can get done within the time frame set out by the new rules. So I'm just going to play you a little bit. Of course, you can't understand any of the words, but I mean, it's a mass that actually gets done. It's just about as fast as you can get through this text as possible. Yeah, so at that point, yeah, Cum Sancto Spiritu and Gloria Dei Patris, and then Amen. And I'm not going to play you the whole thing, but the last, most of, what the heck? I'll give you 30 more seconds. Yeah, so that's 1 minute and 4 seconds. I can get it done in about 50 seconds at my tempo. But as my wife likes to say, that he jams all the words into the first half of it, and then the rest of the piece is amen. So anyway, fortunately, he wrote a large number of masses, and some of which are really great. I mean, most of these late masses are really great works of art. Most famous is the Mass in Time of Troubles, or in time of war, as it's sometimes known, or also known as the Lord Nelson's Mass, which is something, who knows, we might sing at Masterworks sometime. And so, Haydn's known for a lot of things, apart from being a really technically excellent composer whose technique really hides itself, but also a guy of really good humor, and always loved a good joke, and his music, especially the last movements of his symphonies, bubble over with goodwill and humor. And so I'm going to play you something here from the Il Distratto Symphony, number 60. And I'm going to tell you about this is that the musicians are playing this exactly the way Haydn wrote it. other performances I've heard they play the top strings and the middle strings, and then they play the bottom string. The Haydn has asked the violinists to tune their bottom string to F rather than G, and so that's the there's many actually just in the right before COVID time at OCO. If you came to the concerts, you may remember that we played I think of Symphony Number 90 that stops in the last movement right towards the end of it, and it has some silences and then starts again and then stops again, and that's Haydn. That's the fun part of Haydn. Okay, so I'm going to move on to talk about more of his symphonies now, specifically Symphony Number 104, which is known to be the last one, even though it's true that there are 106 of them. But those loose symphonies come much earlier in his output. So just to remind you what the heck a sonata form is, there's three parts: exposition, where themes are exposed; development, where they are developed and played with, and mostly harmonically played with, right? And because we go to all kinds of other keys. Then the recapitulation is a repeat of the exposition. And the main deal is here, the main drama in the classical era is that we start in a key and then we go to the key the fifth higher, right? So in this piece it's D, we're in D here and then we're in A here. And then in the recap we stay in D, that's the big drama. So I'm gonna so I'm going to, let's see how we can do this. Yeah, there we go. No, that's here we go. Okay, this is the beginning of the high symphony number 104. You'll see, only the three notes at the beginning here, and so we'll just listen to these first few bars, and there's a wealth of musical material just in these few notes. That's Bernard Haitink standing there conducting the Vienna Philharmonic, by the way. So you've got, I hope you've got these notes and those notes, and then you've got a semitone, right? So I'm going to show you in the many ways in which he does, in which he creates the rest of the music of the piece out of just really mostly just out of that. It's quite impressive. I'll just mention in terms of the general structure of the symphony, if I can just take a quick aside, because it's important to say, these four movements and he's the guy who really codified it. All the following composers basically took that as an example, but he took the dance suite, as it was known in J.S. Bach and other composers. So a dance suite for, it doesn't matter if it's for orchestra or keyboard or violin or cello or what the heck, or lute, they all start with an introductory movement that is exactly like this. Starts slowly and then has a longer fast section. And in Bach that can be called prelude or overture or symphony, which is where we get this, which is the name that Haydn took. And then there's an allemande and a courante and a sarabande, and then some optional movement, which is not always, but very often a minuet, and then there's a gigue to finish. So Haydn took the suite as it existed, omitted the allemande and the courante, and then kept the sarabande, which is slow, becomes a slow movement, and then the minuet stays just as, imported directly into Haydn's form. And then the gigue, many Haydn symphonies end in 6/8, like a gigue does, and or they can be in 2, but they're always in 2, 2/4, and they're light and sprightly and fun, like a gigue is. So, okay, so that's the intro, and now I'm going to play you the allegro. The allegro of the first movement. Oops. So let's just take this apart here. We've got, okay, so you can say is a new invention. It's not directly from the first notes that we heard. Okay, fine. But this, right? So that's just, right? That's a fifth filled in. The very first two notes you heard in the opening of the piece, he's filled them in and added one extra note like that. Okay, and that'll come back in the last movement and various other places. Okay, and so this is a motive, and this is a motive. And those two, you'll hear them all over the place in the first movement. And then we look at letter A here. Right, is these notes here, right? That's just at the beginning we heard, you notice, so that's again, it's derived from this second little phrase. So he's taken that and added two notes to it. You remember I talked about a semitone that in the beginning of the piece went like this. Right? So it's just the idea of a semitone, right? Except he has, sorry, Eric, my electric keyboard doesn't allow me to play very quickly or very well. Yeah, it's a terrible old electric keyboard I have attached to my computer here. Anyway, so now when you hear that, probably you're not thinking, oh, that, like you listen to all that and you're thinking, meh, how is that, how is that related? It doesn't, it wasn't obvious to you as a first-time listener, but it is there, and it does, you do get it on a subconscious level. And so as we proceed in the piece, you're going to hear more of, I'm going to try and run this. I'm going to run the exposition and the development now, and I'm going to talk you through it. Here's the four-note motive from the first theme. Okay, so now you heard the flute play the first theme again, right? What's interesting is that too many things. Here we go. So there's the da da dum da da. It's exactly the same first theme, right? Except it's in A rather than D. So this is a point that my teacher back at U of T tried to make explicitly clear. In the classical era, it's about the key. The drama is the changing keys, not so much the themes. Now, Haydn's going to give you some themes, some new themes associated with the B group of themes in A major. But in the 19th century, we had the idea that like the A theme is masculine and the B theme is feminine, and this was not completely non-existent to the extent that in Haydn, you see, he simply uses the same theme. It's about the key change is what where the drama is for these guys in the beginning of the sonata form. Okay, we're continuing. Music associated with a group of themes of the B section of the sonata form. Notice this is a descending fifth related to the very opening music. And here an ascending fifth, right? Like basically everything is derived from the very first notes of the So now you see that we have a repeat sign, and we're going right back to the top of the piece. So This is also something derived from these Baroque dances. They were binary forms. They all had a repeat sign in the middle of the piece and at the end. And so this is something that's a hangover from the Baroque era. So definitely Haydn did intend these repeats to be taken. Okay, I'm going to have to fish around here for the. We're now going to make you listen to the. Okay, we're coming to the end of the repeat of the exposition. The development. Notice that he's taking that little theme, that motive that I mentioned before. That's the subject of the whole development, more or less. Here's the basses. This theme in the violins is from the B group. Notice he's going into all kinds of crazy keys. You see the double sharps there. Is that the same motive? The bass is now the main theme, or the main motive. Using this motive to get around everywhere in all kinds of different keys. A big 5 chord, and then the recapitulation. But he's not done developing. So the recapitulation is mostly like the exposition, but you saw there with woodwinds, he never quite stops developing stuff. Okay, I'm going to just take a quick sidestep into, see, in this 104th symphony, 3 of the movements are in sonata form, right? So this is not, I thought I would just take you into a side track into one of his other famous symphonies, the Surprise Symphony, and into the slow movement, which is a theme and variations. And there's lots and lots and lots of his symphonies have theme and variations for the slow movement. So we're just going to listen to this a little bit and then I'll talk about it. Whoops. Hold on a second. So yeah, I guess if I had really wanted to be surprising, I wouldn't have shown you the score. But the you see that there's 8-bar phrases that are repeating. Now we're going to repeat the second half of the phrase, and I'm just going to skip ahead a tiny bit here to give you an idea of the kind of development that you will get. So yeah, these variations in Haydn symphonies. They are very charming. They're very wonderful. But as if you compare them as in terms of compositional technique to something like the Goldberg variations, they're pretty simple because you see that what's happening here. The violas and the seconds have the tune, and the flute and the violins play a little bit of a variation on it. And mostly for the most part, these variations never get way the heck off the beaten track like Beethoven might, or for example. But I did want to take this particular example because this melody crops up someplace else quite unexpectedly. And okay, so now we're going to go into the minuet of the 104th Symphony. And so before they play it, I'm just going to play for you what you see here. Notice that, right? It's the same. It's the same darn thing right off the beginning. He's just put one note in the middle, and then this. You remember, right? So he's added the note B. So this is different, but it's obviously derived from all the stuff in the first movement. And so this is when we get into excellent composing, is when things are that closely motivically related, then the audience will hear new things, but they have the sense somehow that they've already heard them. And this is a great combo platter. It's simultaneously familiar and new. Um, so we're just going to listen to this minuet a little bit. So even within this movement, you can see there's a bum 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 bum, right? The violas and then the basses. They basically take this. It's always motivically developed. He's making something that sounds charming and rustic, but the compositional technique is always very solidly behind it. If you're not familiar with the minuet form, it's always an ABA. Like you see, sometimes there's a repeat sign here, but this time there's also a repeat sign here. And it's what they call a rounded binary. Eventually it has a recapitulation of the main theme. And then the trio is exactly the same form. So here we have, the minuet started like this, right? So the trio starts, etc. So yeah, I mean, basically, and that motive appears throughout the trio, right? So there's two famous expected places where things are going to sound rustic and kind of like country music, or folk music, and that's at the trio of the minuet and in the opening theme of the last movement of almost any Haydn symphony. So I mean, it's very charming and rustic, but it's the motivic unity is very impressive. Okay, and we're gonna look at the last movement a tiny bit. I'll take it apart before we hear it. So this, you remember, that's the first movement. It's not identical, but it's really close. Again, it's exactly what I was saying before. You have the feeling like you've heard it before, but it also sounds new. And also, here's an ascending fifth, right? And there's another, yeah. The structure is, starts here and then goes down to there. And there's so basically this overall structure, and then there's a low A here, right? So the structure of the opening four notes of the piece of the first movement is maintained. So we'll just listen to it a little bit, enjoy it. So notice here, right? So that stuff, that's from the minuet, right? So he's taking parts of different movements and combining them motivically to create just about everything that in melodically that you hear. Awesome, awesome stuff. Okay, so let's see here. I'm going to move on. So, going to talk now a little bit about a piece that maybe Masterworks will perform someday, which is called the Seasons. When Haydn entered a final phase of his life after he got done, there was yet another change in the Esterhazy family, and so he was allowed to move back full time uh, to Vienna, kept on salary until the end of his life, and actually, just to for your information, his predecessor also had the same deal. Like his predecessor at the Esterhazy family was not at all famous, but Haydn had to wait several years to get the full title of Kapellmeister, because there was an old man, still doing the church music there, and the Esterhazys were great in this way. Although they would, command him to write baritone trios, they would also, keep him on a generous stipend, really literally until the day he died. Um, so there's a couple of big, wonderful pieces called the Create. One is the Creation, and one is the Seasons. And the Creation we've done at Masterworks. If you're in the choir, you might remember that one. And Baron von Swieten did the words to both of those, and they both have this problem that the Baron's English was not great, but they wanted to have basically a bilingual possibility, and both of those pieces were premiered in London. Excuse me, I think the Creation was performed first in Birmingham, but in England someplace in any case. And the translation is terrible, and so it's always a problem to do these pieces. You have to work with what, and there's certain famous pieces, certain passages in these famous Haydn pieces for choruses and stuff, and you read them a few times, and it's like, what does that mean anyway? But so, and in fact, when I was doing this talk, you can't. There are recordings in English of the Seasons. I'm going to talk about the Seasons, but you can't even find like the first lines in a uniform translation, so you don't know where to go hunting for the different choruses and arias. So I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you the translations as we go along. And so in this piece, in this aria, Schon eilet froh der Ackermann, so that the orchardist is already happily hurrying to work. The farmer, yeah. You're going to hear a piece of music that you heard already tonight that is imported from a completely different piece. So here we go. I'm going to listen to Mr. Gedker sing this aria, and you guys listen along carefully. Here's the translation.
Schon eilet froh der Ackersmann zur Arbeit auf das Feld. In langen Furchen schreitet dem Fluge flötend nach. Schon eilet froh der Ackersmann zur Arbeit auf das Feld. In langen Furchen schreitet dem Fluge flötend nach. In langen Furchen schreitet dem Fluge flötend nach. In langen Furchen schreitet dem Fluge flötend nach. In langen Furchen schreitet dem Fluge flötend nach.
Okay, so here's what we're going to do. If you recognize that piece and you from earlier in the lecture, you write it in the chat right now. And okay, I'm giving you a few seconds to write that down. You write that, and we'll see how many of you can name the piece that you already heard this evening that you heard in that aria. Okay, that's a bit of a geek quiz we're doing here, and Andrew Cripps is going to come up with some kind of generous prize for all the winners. Okay, so here's another fun one from the summer part. Ach, das Ungewitter naht, which means the storm is coming, or more accurately, ach, the storm is coming. lot of fun there. Just giving you a little taste of this wonderful piece, which perhaps we'll sing someday, and you never know. Here's another one. Of course, has to do with hunting.
Hingezählt.
Anyway, a lot of, as you can see, there's a lot of tone painting and atmospheric, kind of, but none equaled by this one. First of all, this is you'll hear there's a lot of this kind of thing in the creation also about basically, music that describes various animals or their, the noises they make, and so we'll just I'll let you hear the music before I tell you the little story behind it.
Die düsteren Wolken trennen sich. Gestillet ist der Stürme Wut. Vor ihrem Untergange blickt noch die Sonne empor. Und von dem letzten Strahl glänzt mit Perlenschmuck geziert die Flur, mit Perlenschmuck geziert die Flur.
There's the calf. So you hear the sound effect before the thing is mentioned. This is...
Zum lang gewohnten Stalle kehrt gesättigt und erfricht das fette Rind zurück.
And then that's the quail.
Im Garten ruft die Wachte schon.
Cricket comes. The frogs.
Aus dem Sumpfe quakt der Frosch.
And that's the, this is the Abendglocke, the Vesper bells. Yeah. So, Haydn's got, and this is, in the creation you find things like this too. But so you saw, quails and frogs and all kinds of little cutesy things portrayed in music. But this is something, I'm going to read you now a quote that Haydn wrote to his publisher. He says, "NB, this whole passage with its imitation of the frogs was not my idea. I was forced to write this Frenchified trash. This wretched idea disappears rather soon when the whole orchestra is playing, but it simply cannot be included in the pianoforte reduction." So this is just a, apparently he later said that he was joking about it, but and the whole Frenchified thing is something that they did going back to Couperin. Sort of this kind of tone painting was regarded somehow as French. But anyway, so this is the kind of humor and character that Haydn had. And I think that's about all I'd like to say and play for you tonight. So I'm going to look over here to my to the chat room, and I'm going to see who won the contest. Andrew's going to buy a bottle of scotch, I think he said. Surprise Symphony, that's right, Eric. Whoa, way to go. And then Jim Service also, very good. Eva Wilkie and Gene Barber and Jim Service. That's true. Oh no, Jim Service was talking about something else. He says Das Gewitter not reminds me of the chorus from
Jim
the lecture.
Service, number 94 is the surprise.
Yes, yeah, no, he was the, in fact he was the first one. He was the first one, and so congratulations. But it's that was a totally unexpected place to hear this surprise symphony theme. So I hope you enjoyed this. Does anybody have any questions? You can either put them in the chat or you can unmute yourself and say whatever you want to say, and I will answer to the best of my ability if anybody wants to ask any questions or
Charles,
chat about the Raptors who are playing right now. Yes, Doug.
where does his brother Michael fit in? Did their paths cross during his lifetime?
Michael was his younger
Professionally?
brother, and he did follow him to Vienna. In fact, I think he also worked at St. Stephen's, and the Michael Haydn was also a prolific writer of symphonies. In fact, my former teacher, Harold Farberman, was the first person to record all of Michael Haydn's symphonies. But I have to say, Doug, that much more I cannot say, and I didn't prepare very much about Michael Haydn. But it's interesting that these two guys. I mean, by far Joseph is the more famous one, but he did. Thank you for bringing up that he had a brother who was also a composer. That's good. I can always rely on Doug for a good question. Anybody else want to say anything? Christina wants to ask.
Yeah, Charles, you were talking about sort of the way that the symphony was codified and evolved from the Baroque movements into the four symphonic movements. And I was wondering if you could talk about how the instrumentation was codified. So how we got to a place where all of a sudden there were clarinets in every symphony, and there were all those wind instruments along with the strings and so forth.
Well, as many of you will already know, the clarinet didn't exist in Bach's day, and so it was quite a new thing. And many of the early symphonies of Haydn don't have clarinet either. So the string orchestra was from the Renaissance era, the basic sound of the orchestra. And so in the Baroque era, oboes and bassoons were added, and also flutes. More or less, that's how things were in the Baroque. Those are the instruments you could find, and they were more popular. Wind instruments were more popular in both the Baroque era and the Classical era in France than in other places. In Italy, they continued to be focused on string instruments, which is, of course, as you're probably aware, where they were invented there. The modern string instruments were invented and perfected there in the Baroque era. But in France, in Paris, they were very interested in developing wind instruments and use them. Like you can find wind instruments much more in Baroque French music than in any other place. There's a lot of symphonies, early Mozart symphonies, that have just two oboes and two horns. That's a sort of a standard combination, and some Haydn symphonies like that also. But there's, you heard from the Symphony Number 6, there's already a flute in there, and independent bassoon parts as well. I mean, as you know, in the Baroque instrument era, bassoons were most of the time just doubling the cellos and basses. So that just basically it grew up. Trumpets and timpani are kind of a part of it depends on what's around. Like these are kind of a military music attachment, and if the prince is rich enough, then he can have that, and the composer can use it in the symphony as well. But if not, then not. And so actually, and think it was all, completely at what you could get your hands on. It becomes a financial consideration, right? In that third stage of his life, when Haydn returned part-time to work for the Esterhazy Prince, there were no woodwinds in the masses that he wrote in the first versions. They were that's it. He had strings, and the trumpets and timpani were still there for the fanfare music they would do for ceremonies and stuff. So, that was strictly not Haydn's decision. It was just what the prince decided he wanted to pay for. But in the absence of any financial interference, then by the end of Haydn's life, his standard orchestra became two flutes, two oboes, two clarinets, two bassoons, two trumpets, two horns, and a pair of timpani. So that was a kind of, and Beethoven used that also. And they continued to be more into winds in Paris than in other places. For example, you know, Mozart's Paris Symphony uses two flutes when a lot of the time he only prefers to use one. So that's what I think that's what I can tell you. I hope I'm hearing a beeping sound.
That's great. Thank you.
Is that to do with something? Nothing? You don't hear a beeping sound? Good. Okay, super. Any other questions? Okay, well, I think, oh, Eric wants to ask a question.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to keep anyone waiting too
No
long,
problem.
but yeah, I'm just wondering. Thank you so much for first of all, because I've yet to play a lot of Haydn. Actually, I've more on Beethoven and Chopin than like Mozart even. So this is very useful for my future understanding. So
Great.
yeah, thank you. And so I'm just wondering because I happen to be playing the sonata in E minor, first movement for a competition that needs a Haydn sonata requirement, first movement. So I just wonder because you talked a little bit of the sonata form, and how his symphonies or his music are more motivic. So just maybe expand on how that affects anything that has to do with the sonatas, because they seem to have motivic kind of behind it, but also melodically.
Yeah. I mean, the symphony that we looked at is very, very motivically constructed. That doesn't mean to say that there aren't long melodies in some of his music. I would probably remember the E minor sonata if I looked at the score or if I heard it, but I can't comment like right off the top of my head. But if you wanted, I mean, I could look at it. We could talk about it at some future time. You know, that'd be if you'd like. I would be happy to do that for you. And the you know, as a piano composer for piano or harpsichord, which were interchangeable at the time, Haydn wrote 52 sonatas, which are similar to symphonies formally, but don't have a minuet usually, and also some concertos, small number of concertos for keyboard. But yeah, I mean, well, let's talk in the next few days. I'll look at the score and we can talk about it if you like.
Great, yeah,
Uh,
that's another lecture for another day. Lot to
Great.
talk about symphonies already.
Lots. Oh, you can go on. You can go on about this stuff forever, which is not my goal tonight. And just last call for questions. Last call for questions tonight. Anybody? Okay. Well, I'm so grateful to see you all, and we'll see you again sometime. All the best. Take care.